Hello and good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. So Dr. Mahathir Mohamad has claimed that his statement on the events in France had been misrepresented and taken out of context. Now, Twitter deleted one of the tweets in his thread after initially flagging it for glorifying violence. And Dr. Mahathir's posting had also quoted widespread criticism from foreign dignitaries. But I think, Sharaad, tonight what I think is interesting for us to consider is the rationales. What was behind Dr. Mahathir's insistence that his blog entry should have been read in its entirety, instead of singling it out as any single paragraph or tweet, because that was what happened, right? When he tweeted multiple times in a single thread, it would be one of those tweets that caught the attention of many.
Well, I don't know if that is really a solid defense, considering that, you know, if you actually wind back the story back to the events that led to the tragic murder of that French teacher, we have a lot of things that need to be put in context. Right. Emmanuel Macron's statement that, you know, that generated headlines about Islam being in crisis also, I believe, needed to be put in context, because enough statements putting out there that what he was talking about was separatism rather than that. He, of course, was playing to the gallery, as was Dr. Mahathir. I think it's very clear that politicians play to their gallery in order to gain points either internationally or domestically. And the sad thing, I think, Melissa, is that we are now consumed by this discussion about you know, whether we should do a forensic reading of Dr. Mahathir's thoughts, you know, that consisted in those multiple tweets, or, you know, and so on and so forth. And rather than getting a deeper understanding of French society, and I don't know if that's what Malaysians need at this point in time, or really a focus on all the really important issues that the country is facing, you know, unemployment, you know, poverty. These are the collateral damage of this particular, you know, media circus.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, and you have to, I think, look at why, you know, Malaysian politicians are weighing in on a domestic issue in another country, and whether, you know, I think everything with a pinch of salt, right? Understanding motive, understanding timing, understanding you know, the reasons behind a certain, to be more critical and not so knee-jerk, not have such knee-jerk reactions. I think there's also you know, been allegations to a voter base, particularly one that has largely sidelined Dr. Mahathir in recent days, and I think this has gotten him back front and center in everybody's conversation. Yes,
and not in a good way, right? Because he's not helping us shape a conversation around what the country really needs at this point in time. I mean, needless to say, he has weighed in on all those other issues as well. This, you know, comes, and this tweet about the French situation and the statement made by Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, is, you know, comes after actually Anwar Ibrahim had weighed in on the question, you know, Hishamuddin Hussein had weighed in on the question. So many people had, but I guess Dr. Mahathir is a master provocateur. I mean, he really knows how to stir things up, right? The question is, does that lead us to any deeper understanding of the context in which that the violence occurred, you know? And I think that is where it's clear that it isn't. I mean, this is not what you know, Dr. Mahathir is helping deepen. It's not understanding.
Well, I wonder whether that is also the role of the media, right? Because, you know, rather than picking up all these really sensational headlines and these really sensational tweets and comments and postings without context, I think that is a disservice to the readers, to the viewers, without giving context as to the history of France, as to what's happening there. And I think we haven't really learned anything, rather than just reacting to inflammatory statements.
Yeah, and very quickly, there's violence all over the world. I mean, today in West Africa, you know, dozens of people have been killed over the months because, you know, old politicians are trying to cling to power, you know. And also we have this terrible attack on a madrasa in Pakistan, you know, in the last week, you know, killing 8 adults and injuring over 150 children. I mean, if Malaysian politicians want to weigh in on, you know, the conditions and the fate of Muslims around the world, which I think is perfectly legitimate, then why not pick up on those issues?
Right.
You know, a Taliban attack on a school in Peshawar in Pakistan. Terrible tragedy that Malaysian politicians, I think, need to kind of also step up to the plate.
All right, well, let's take a quick look at other news that happened today. Cinemas nationwide say they will be suspending operations beginning tomorrow. According to the Malaysian Association of Film Exhibitors, this is all in an effort to safeguard the industry in the long run. So shut down temporarily for long-term sustainability. There's also been a lack of new movies released in the short term, which I think was essential in attracting moviegoers back to the cinema. So in response to this, FINAS, it has come out to say that it's looking at a targeted action plan to help the cinemas. Now, I think it's also important to take a look not just at the impact to the jobs lost from this move, but also the impact to the local film scene, right, Sharaad?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, you know, the distribution of local films depends on the cinema. I mean, one might be critical of the cinema system that exists in Malaysia.
The compulsory screening scheme.
Well, that's the good stuff, right? So the tayang wajib, or the wajib tayang, which is really a way in which cinemas have been forced by regulators and a policy really to help local industry. I mean, that's the good stuff. But, you know, there are people who will argue that the cinema chains have their own agenda, doesn't necessarily help smaller independent filmmakers. All that aside, I mean, the loss of any component of our economy is something to be, I think, revisited, to be thought about and lamented. I mean, I don't think the cinemas, you know, even going into this pandemic, were in a good state because, you know, we had all these competitors, the Netflixes of the world, and all that content being streamed, and so consumption and habits have been changing, right?
Yes.
So yes, they were already stressed out, and then the pandemic has not done much to help the situation there. Yeah,
definitely. And I really wonder what the future of entertainment is going to be like. Are we going to see cinemas recover? You know, whether that's anytime soon or in a year or so, or whether the nature of cinemas will have to change. I mean, you know, the US has drive-through cinemas. Is that something that Malaysia can do? If
I think that was actually put out there some time ago, Melissa. I'm a big fan.
Drive-in cinemas, not drive-through cinemas.
Yeah. I am a big fan of going to the cinema. I love the big screen, Melissa, and I would help promote that particular way of consuming cinema. You know, I'm not a big fan of watching
on the small
movies
screen?
on small devices. I mean, I see people, you know, on MRT, you know, on the MRT watching an entire movie on a tiny screen. I think it must really hurt your head.
Right. Well, we're going to take a quick break here on Consider This, but after this we'll be speaking to Unicef about the second installment of their Families on the Edge report. That's all coming up in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned to Consider This. Hello, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. Earlier today, the United Nations agencies UNFPA and Unicef released the second phase of a long-term study on the impact of the MCO on the women and children of low-income urban families who are living in city council housing projects, or PPR flats, a program Perumahan Rakyat. Now, joining us on the show tonight to share more about the findings of the Families on the Edge Part 2 survey, we have Stephen Barrett. He's the Chief of Social Policy at Unicef Malaysia. Stephen, the last time we spoke about the first phase of the study, it was looking at the immediate effects, the immediate after effects of the MCO. Help us understand, what is the focus of this second installment of the Families on the Edge report?
Great, thank you very much, Melissa. So, you know, after the MCO, we found that families have been very badly affected by that period, and now we were looking to see whether, as we hoped, that they had started to recover. You know, we were all expecting households. You know, we've been talking about V-shaped recoveries from the COVID crisis. So we wanted to see whether that was the case for these households. And what we found is that, yes, there had been some evidence of recovery, but that recovery was partial. So we found that incomes were still lower than pre-crisis on average. It was also uneven. So many households, some households hadn't recovered at all, some households were worse off. Some households had recovered to a lesser extent than others. So, for example, single female-headed households affected by disability, were still struggling much more than the average. So it was very much an incomplete recovery, and we also found that households were that their savings had been impacted very heavily by the period up till now. So they were really in a very poor position to weather the coming wave of the MCO that we're now facing.
Stephen, can I ask you about the unemployment situation? So you say there about 1 in 3 unemployed adults. What is the cause of that? Is it just generally the lack of available jobs? Or is it that there's also other barriers like people refusing to move to get those jobs and so on and so forth? I mean, do you have a granular sense of what are the causes of unemployment among the urban poor? So
I think there's more that we need to know. I think unemployment among youth is a sort of a structural issue in many countries and needs to be understood as such, and COVID exacerbates that pre-existing structural challenge. I think when you look at low-income families, we clearly have an issue around skills. We clearly have an issue around mismatch with skills to the labour market. And also, you talk about place and availability of economic opportunities and relevant further training opportunities for young people to move from school into good quality employment. I think these are all issues. The thing we have to understand, of course, is that when people that enter labour markets at times of economic crisis, that there is a risk of long-term scarring to their economic prospects throughout their lifetime. And we've seen that from other countries over long-term data series. So we need to have very, very robust, targeted interventions for young adults who are disconnected from the labour market. And that requires a lot of profiling of individuals. It requires incentives both on the part of employers and the younger people themselves. And it also requires things like psychosocial support to those individuals, as well as support to the wider family that they are in. But I think there's also another really important fact that helping people to re-enter the labour market when they've become significantly disconnected from the labour market is very, very hard. And what we need to do is have early intervention in the education system, supporting children and young people who are at risk of not entering good quality employment.
Okay.
To make sure that they get targeted support when they're still in school, when they're making those critical transitions, to ensure prevention is better than cure in this respect.
Right. Well, since you mentioned children, I'd like to pivot the conversation there. I mean, after months of lockdowns and the frequent school closures, what was really interesting was that this survey had also found that parents are reporting that their children are losing interest in studies in school, and that there are children who are dropping out, that it's difficult getting children to return to schools. Talk to us a little bit about addressing these challenges, addressing the dropout rate.
So the evidence from the report really suggests 2 driving factors here. The first one is the financial insecurity that families are facing, and there's a risk that young people, particularly upper secondary age children, enter informal labour markets, work to supplement household income, to help care for younger siblings while parents look for additional economic opportunities. And then there's also the psychological impact. And we've all seen this from our own families, the significant psychological impact on children who have been out of school for long periods of time. So we need interventions both for the families to ensure that they don't need to resort to children entering work early. And we also need to support the children who are returning to school with that sort of psychological support and encouragement, motivation, recognition recognising the significant vulnerability and the significant hardship and discomfort that they've experienced over the past few months. And that demands mental health services in schools, services that are relevant and for the needs and preferences of young people are really, really important.
Okay, well, Stephen, we're going to take a quick break, but we'll have you stay on the line because there's so much more to cover. Let's come back and continue this conversation with Stephen in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned to Consider This. Hi, if you've just joined us, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan, and we're speaking to Stephen Barrett. He's the Chief of Social Policy at Unicef Malaysia. Let's talk a little bit about the immediate policy responses as recommended by the second installment of the Families on the Edge report. Stephen, now a couple of the recommendations that you've put forth include extending some of the financial assistance to include children and older people and people living with disabilities. And I thought that was quite interesting, particularly as one of the things that you've pointed out in the report was that the households reported difficulties in meeting costs associated with school attendance. Things like trouble getting masks, trouble paying for transportation, trouble with meals, not being able to provide quality meals. Talk to us about the feasibility of including these types of assistance to target specifically children. Okay,
so Malaysia already has a social welfare assistance for children, people with disabilities and older people, but at the moment they are targeted to the poorest, approximately 1.5% of the population. Meanwhile, the social security system at the top covers workers who are in formal sector employment, and we have this missing middle at the moment. And what we are calling for, and as has been called for in many, many countries, is for the extension of a social protection floor that provides basic child benefits, disability benefits, and a basic old age pension to a much broader proportion of those age groups and demographic groups. So, and this is very, very feasible in Malaysia. This is done in many countries around the world, and certainly upper income, middle income countries such as Malaysia this is well within their means to do that. Which is not to say it's cheap. But it's what has been shown to be absolutely critical to reducing poverty, and particularly reducing poverty in times of economic crisis.
Right. Stephen, if I could just interject here. Your report also notes that only 2% of those in need coming from the informal sector have applied for the Prehating special grant. And you suggest that there's a lack of knowledge or information about this. And I wonder, that seems quite crucial. There seems to be a lot of effort and investment by government in putting out the message. So why is it that this message, crucial to its chief stakeholder, not hitting the ground? Well, what's going on there?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, maybe it's hard for us who are exposed to these messages and to appreciate the level of social exclusion that many households, the lower income households, do experience. So it is difficult for us to understand that. I think what we know from a lot of other areas is that the lowest income households often need direct contact and facilitation through social work services, etc., community development services, to enable them to access services that are available. So I think that there's maybe opportunities to strengthen that outreach to those families and using channels that they have most contact with. There's also a potential sense that maybe some of these things are simply not realistic or relevant to many households. If the small grants that are designed to support entrepreneurial business activities, if those opportunities are not available to you, if you haven't got the skills, if your wider family situation isn't conducive to taking some of those opportunities forward, then that's also perhaps a reason why we're not seeing the uptake there.
Stephen, do you think there is a reluctance in government to expand the social welfare system and people getting expertise, putting people on the payroll in order to deliver the increased and enhanced, social supports that you're talking about? Because it's one thing to provide a bigger budget for social safety net, but if you don't provide a means to put that out in an effective way, then it's sort of self-defeating, isn't it? Right.
Yeah. So, of course, it's difficult to win champions for increased investment in social welfare, particularly at a time like this when budgets are tight. And many governments around the world are, trying to deal with these trade-offs. I think the government has demonstrated considerable willingness to take steps to expand support for low-income families, and we've seen that in the BPN, and we've seen that with other sort of one-off supports being provided, for example, to single mothers and people with disabilities. I think there's understandable anxiety or concern to commit to longer-term interventions, but when you don't know what the budget's going to be looking like, revenues going to be looking like over the next year or so, and that's but I think that there probably most people would argue that there is scope for that reprioritisation within the existing budget envelope, and that the investments that we're talking about are affordable and good value for money.
Right. Well, Stephen, you talked about long-term interventions. What about short-term interventions? Budgets being tabled very soon. What are you hoping to see, particularly to help those who need it the most?
So, as I said, we are advocating for the introduction of a basic social protection floor for children, older people, and people with disabilities. Obviously, the poverty line has recently been revised, so we now have 6% and 5.6% of the population considered as in absolute poverty. We have 16.9% in relative poverty, and ideally we would see extension of these basic life cycle support programs to children, older people with disabilities living below those thresholds, but also at high risk of falling under those thresholds. And this has been done in many countries. I think we also need to see strengthened support for single mothers in terms of access to skills, access to affordable childcare, and then strengthen services. Everything from the social welfare system desperately needs additional investment to support low-income families to access the services that they need.
Right. So what's next for the UN agencies working on this report? I mean, you've got the second installment now. What are you going to do with the findings of this second phase?
So over the coming weeks, we hope to be having dialogue events with the government and other stakeholders so we can explore some of these policy options in more detail. Of course, the 12th Malaysia Plan is being developed as we speak, so we would hope that various interventions and commitments could be included within that. And then we'll work, with ministry by ministry, that's both the Ministry of Women, the Ministry of Education, and others, to explore how we can strengthen the coordination between different interventions. And there's a strong evidence base for the impact of coordinating interventions, for example, on income
and they're happy, Stephen, are they happy to be working with you with the findings of this report?
Yes, absolutely. We have a very strong partnership with the government and a range of ministries. We've presented this report to the EPU and the Ministry of Women, and we have an ongoing dialogue on that. And we'll see where that goes over the coming weeks and months with the budget and the 12th Malaysia Plan. So we have an ongoing partnership with all of those agencies.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us on the show tonight and for speaking with us. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.